I should probably introduce myself. My name's Tom Antarena. I currently serve as the chair of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and it's a real pleasure and privilege to be here again at another Peace News webinar, this time to discuss some really important issues surrounding the 20th anniversary of the invasion and war against Iraq. And for me, this is really important stuff to remember, because I first came into peace activism and anti-war activism around this time. I can't remember the exact date, but 20 years ago, I remember driving into the middle of nowhere just outside of Nottingham to go and protest against a public meeting that Geoff Hoon, who we'll hear more about in this session, where he was speaking. On Friday evening, I was invited to a debate at the University of Exeter in a student union society, where the motion up for debate was this house would scrap Trident. And I was up against somebody who was a now retired former senior civil servant in the Ministry of Defence, who trotted out the standard line that many of us would be familiar with in defence of the Trident weapon system, which pivoted around the proposal that these weapons have kept the peace. These weapons have kept the peace and prevented a war for some decades now. And that was really the beginning of the end, and the end of the argument, bar some technical details. What he skimmed over, and which he dodged when I tried to introduce these questions into debate, are the serial nuclear threats that have been made. And people will be aware of recent nuclear threats within the last year that have edged us closer to midnight on the doomsday clock. But there is a long history of such threats, and that history is really illustrative of an important element of the whole way in which the nuclear weapon systems are used on a day-to-day and a week-to-week and a year-to-year basis, and have important implications for thinking through what nuclear weapons actually mean, how they have shaped international relations over a long period of time, and what politicians really mean when they stand up and defend the so-called and misnamed nuclear deterrence. So Milan is going to speak about the particulars of the nuclear threats that were made by both Britain and the United States around Iraq 20 or more years ago. Earlier examples will be mentioned. Many of you will know that Milan is the editor of Peace News and a writer and analyst on these and many other related issues to do with war and peace. He will speak for about 20 minutes. We will then break out again into those breakout groups for 5 minutes or so to reflect and discuss some of the points that Milan has raised. And then we'll return again for a further 40 minutes to talk through the issues and to put questions to Milan. So I'm looking forward to a really interesting presentation from Milan and an equally interesting and educative discussion. So it's over to you, Milan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom, for being part of this meeting, for chairing it, and we're very grateful. My name is Milan Rai. I'm the editor of Peace News. For folk who haven't encountered Peace News before, the paper's been going since 1936, standing up for non-violence and non-violent movements for change. Welcome to long-term subscribers, and also to folk who are just hearing about Peace News for the first time. Welcome if you've read a lot about nuclear threats, and welcome also to folk who may be hearing about it at this meeting for the first time. So the topic tonight is actually not just 2002, 2003. I'm actually going to say a little bit about the longer history of US-UK nuclear threats against Iraq. It's quite a narrow talk, because all I'm going to do is I'm going to list some nuclear threats against Iraq. I'm not going in this talk to go into the larger context about it, including why I think we should stop using the word deterrence in the way that we do. I've been writing about this topic for 30 years. And I just want to say a word before I begin talking about nuclear threats against Iraq, about the war in Iraq in 2003, which many people around the world saw as the crime of the century, which followed another major crime, which was the economic sanctions on Iraq, which killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. And that there were many deaths caused in the war. There were many deaths before the war through sanctions. And obviously there has been chaos and destruction and death and suffering since the invasion as a result of the invasion, that act of aggression. As we go forward, my invitation to you would be to be as skeptical as you can. I think the most useful way of using this session is to try to think about the questions that the most skeptical member of your peace group, if you happen to be in a peace group, might ask, or what a skeptical neighbor would ask if you were telling them about this talk. And obviously, one of the key questions would be, how can you prove that? Where's the evidence? In a very strange move, I'm now going to run through some other questions that occurred to me, like things that, questions that might come into people's minds, or anyway, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna run through some. Is it just Iraq that's been subjected to US-UK nuclear threats? What effect did these nuclear threats actually have on Iraq? Were the US and UK actually ready to use nuclear weapons in these crises, or were these empty threats? What do the British public think about nuclear threats like these? Are these nuclear threats just one-off improvisations in particular crisis situations, or maybe it sounds crazy, is making nuclear threats against non-nuclear weapon states a core part of nuclear policy, British nuclear doctrine? What have you got against the word deterrence? Have there only been UK nuclear threats against WMD states, ones with nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons? Is the solution to this problem of nuclear threats the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Isn't there already some kind of ban on making nuclear threats against non-nuclear weapon states? Isn't it illegal to make nuclear threats against a non-nuclear weapon state? If you haven't heard about the British nuclear threats before, why haven't I heard about them before? Why don't they get talked about more? How can we stop the government making these kinds of threats? So those are questions that might or might not come to mind for you. Now, right now, I'm going to list some of the nuclear threats that I'm aware of. And the story starts in 1961, when Britain granted Kuwait formal independence and manufactured a crisis in the Persian Gulf to send a message to Iraq, to Egypt, and to other states in the region that Britain intended to remain a power in the region. According to RAF historian Andrew Brooks, who used to fly a British strategic nuclear bomber, British strategic nuclear bombers were mobilized during this 1961 crisis. The quote from his book is that the UK placed V bombers at readiness in Malta as part of the larger operation. V bombers were the Valiant, Vulcan, Victor bombers, which were Britain's strategic nuclear force at the time. It's sort of like saying Britain sent Trident out to the Mediterranean and kind of like mobilized it as part of an intervention in the Middle East. And that's a quote from Brooks's book, Force V, The History of Britain's Airborne Deterrent, page 114. That's 1961. If we roll forward 30 years, Iraq, 1991, as everyone here knows, there was another US, UK, and French assault on Iraq in 1991, and a list of 16 US and UK nuclear threats against Iraq was compiled in a 1992 CND briefing, Nuclear Targeting of the Third World, by Milan Rai, that's me, and Declan McHugh, who was the information officer right then. And this is one version of it here. So just to take a few examples, there are two examples of US nuclear threats at the time. 3rd of February 1991, US Defense Secretary Dick Cheney said, "I would not at this point advocate the use of nuclear weapons." That's talking about the Iraq War. That's from the Financial Times, 4th of February, 1991. The 5th of February, 1991, the president, US President George W. Bush, refused to rule out the use of US weapons of mass destruction, in other words, US nuclear weapons, saying he would wait for a recommendation from his military commanders. The quote from him is, "I think it's better never to say what you may be considering." That's one of the lines from the press conference. That's from the Financial Times, 7th of February, 1991. Okay, here's a couple of UK nuclear threats from 1991. One is from John Major, answering a question from a Tory MP, Sir Trevor Skeet, who asked whether the Prime Minister would reserve the option to use a nuclear device if that is necessary for the protection of our own troops from what he called poisonous gas or bacteria, chemical or biological weapons. And this is the whole of John Major's reply to Trevor Skeet. "We have made it very clear to the Iraqis that we would take a very serious view indeed of the use of any chemical or biological weapons. But I must say to my honourable friend that we have a wide range of weapons and resources at our hands, and I do not envisage needing to use the sanction that he suggests." So that is from Hansard, 15th of January, 1991, volume 183, column 726. So what Major said was, "I do not envisage needing to use nuclear weapons against Iraq." That is not ruling it out and indicating that it's a live option. So on the 3rd of February, 1991, and this is a report from The Guardian, the 4th of February, 1991, about what Douglas Hurd, Major's Foreign Secretary, said. This is a quote from The Guardian. "Mr. Hurd said that if Iraq responded to an Allied land assault by using chemical weapons, President Saddam would be certain to provoke a massive response. Language the US and Britain employ to leave open the option of using chemical or nuclear weapons." So that is The Guardian saying that Mr. Hurd had made a chemical or nuclear threat against Iraq if there was the use of chemical weapons by Iraq. So let's scroll forward to the 2003 war. The path to war was really started by George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech, his speech at the end of January 2002. But things really started ramping up in March 2002. And so turning to the US side first, what happened in March 2002 was that there were a bunch of leaks from the latest version of the US Nuclear Posture Review, which is sort of like, what is US nuclear policy? So this is a quote from the Sunday Telegraph on the 10th of March 2002, front page. "President Bush has drawn up secret plans for nuclear conflict with 7 countries, according to a classified Pentagon report leaked in Washington yesterday. The report, signed off by Donald Rumsfeld, the Defense Secretary, says that America must be ready to use nuclear weapons against China, Russia, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Libya, and Syria." So that is from the Sunday Telegraph, and the Sunday Telegraph also said that the Nuclear Posture Review is understood to identify 3 circumstances in which nuclear weapons could be used: against targets able to withstand non-nuclear attack, i.e. buried, hardened bunkers and such like; in retaliation for the use of nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons; and, this is still quoting from the Sunday Telegraph, which now quotes from the Nuclear Posture Review, and in the event of surprising military developments. The Financial Times, the next day, front page, 11th of March 2002, said that the Nuclear Posture Review calls for the development of nuclear missiles that could penetrate underground bunkers thought to harbor dangerous weapons programs. following day, Financial Times, 12th of March, page 12, they reported that the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the US, Douglas Feith, had briefed certain selected members of Congress the previous month in February about the nuclear posture review. And he had said that the administration envisaged using nuclear weapons not only for deterrence, but also, quote, for holding at risk highly threatening targets that cannot be addressed by other means. The Financial Times also reported, the study indicates the US might use nuclear strikes preemptively against countries developing weapons of mass destruction, that's before they've actually got them, and could also do so in the event of large-scale conventional attacks, such as the Iraqi invasion of Israel or a North Korean invasion of South Korea. From what I've seen of the leaked bits of the nuclear posture review, it actually talked about Iraqi military attacks on any of its neighbors could bring about nuclear strikes. So in the Times, the foreign editor, Bronwyn Maddox, wrote about all of these leaks on the 11th of March, 2002. And she pointed out that Dick Cheney, who had become US vice president at this point, Cheney was touring the Middle East trying to drum up support for a war in Iraq. And so this is what Bronwyn Maddox wrote in the Times. Should we assume that these stories are an orchestrated part of the vice president's roadshow? Yes, for want of evidence to the contrary. The nuclear posture review from which the leaks have come is a document of almost magical properties, so conveniently have segments of its classified contents emerge to coincide with crucial diplomatic moves by the administration. It is, if you like, the second barrel of Bush's Axis of Evil speech, which had been delivered in January. So coming over to the UK side, again, the threats happened in March 2002. It's like a coordinated ramping up of threats by the US and UK. So the Defense Secretary, Geoff Hoon, appeared before the House of Commons Select Committee on Defense on the 20th of March 2002. A Labour member of the Select Committee, Jim Knight, asked about nuclear deterrence against states like Iraq. There's actually a bit more detail in the Peace News article in the current issue. And as part of his questioning, he asked, do you think that states such as, let us say, Iraq, do you think such a state would be deterred by our deterrent from using weapons of mass destruction against our forces in the field? So this isn't about attacking Britain. This is about our forces in the field. Hoon emphasized the word confidence. He said he would be less confident about nuclear deterrence in relation to governments like that of Saddam Hussein, governments which don't care about their own populations. So Knight asked about this confidence thing. Is it a confidence about whether or not they believe you would use them, nuclear weapons, or confidence about whether or not they would care about whether you use them? And this is the whole of Hoon's reply to that follow-up question, like, what kind of confidence are you talking about? Hoon said, they can be absolutely confident that in the right conditions, we would be willing to use our nuclear weapons. What I cannot be absolutely confident about is whether that would be sufficient to deter them from using a weapon of mass destruction in the first place. A few days later, 24th of March, 2002, Hoon appeared on ITV's Jonathan Dimbleby program and, according to a Guardian report, insisted that the government reserve the right to use nuclear weapons if Britain or British troops were threatened by chemical or biological weapons. That's a quote from a report by Richard Norton Taylor called Bush's Nuke Bandwagon. That's the article, Guardian, 27th of March. Hoon made those statements in March, and then there was some follow-up in Parliament on the 29th of April, 2002, a month later. And a Labour MP, Malcolm Savage, asked Hoon whether British policy about deterrence had changed. He was asked about his recent comments concerning the possible use of nuclear weapons against Iraq. Hoon wouldn't really answer the question, and he he said, ultimately, and in conditions of extreme self-defense, nuclear weapons would have to be used. So a few minutes later, another Labour MP, Diane Abbott, asked for a little bit more detail about what he meant by extreme self-defense. Hoon refused to be specific. He said it was important to point out that the government have nuclear weapons available to them, and that in certain specified conditions to which I have referred, we would be prepared to use them. Now, if you read through the debate that had just happened, he doesn't say what the certain specified conditions are or would be. He had said on television that the government reserved the right to use nuclear weapons if Britain or British troops were threatened by chemical or biological weapons. And he'd given that same impression in his evidence to the Defence Select Committee on the 20th of March. There was a very rare comment on this set of nuclear threats, British nuclear threats, in The Guardian a few months later. Columnist Hugo Young, 6th of June, 2002, wrote some very worried remarks about this. And the title of his article was, Hoon's talk of preemptive strikes could be catastrophic. So that is a list of some of the nuclear threats to which Iraq was subjected before the invasion of 2003. Exactly what the meaning of it is and what the implications are, I'll leave it to you to ask questions which focus on the bits that you want to draw out.